Well, hello, everybody. Hi there. How's everyone doing? Happy Wednesday. It's nice to see you guys. I might look a little different today. I don't know if you noticed. It's just my hair is really... Right? Isn't this super fancy? I've got a green screen, you guys. It's so cool. Look, even my hand's even disappearing. It's very, very fun. I totally get the hype for this. I think it's awesome. It's lovely to see you all. Lovely, lovely, lovely. Thank you for coming. This is so much fun. And hello, you guys. I am Nancy. You should definitely, you were here, I think, when I took this picture. This is the Dordogne behind me. This is Dordogne. This is from the hilltop city of Dome. And we were there last summer on our trip. It was beautiful, as you can see, which is really, really fun. Isn't this great? So today we're talking about reading wine labels. I do have a lovely presentation as always, which I will get started with in a moment. But I really felt like I have one more thing I wanted to say to you all. And I think that's just thank you for coming. So without further ado, I will go ahead and get us moving right on along. So if you give me a moment, all this fancy, fancy, fun new equipment, I'm gonna show you. I could get used to this, you guys. Can everyone see me okay and hear me okay? Everyone's good, yeah? Excellent. Few nods are great. John, Mendoza Malbec, excellent. Cheryl, beautiful. Delarche, 2017 Bourgogne, La Garenne. Hi, New York City, absolutely. Well, hi there. So today we are talking about how to read a wine label, which is, you know, the thing about the wine label is that, I mean, it's kind of it's the hallmark, it's the trademark, and it's really like the calling card for the wine, right? This is what many people use to make their choices about buying wine, the pictures that are on the label, right? How many of you out there either know someone, I'm sure none of you would ever do that. But in reality, there is definitely the reality that is the wine label. It's the marketing. It is the face. It's the business card. It's everything that you have to wrap everything all up and try and express your inner self so that people understand it, right? As a wine, which is like us being like what we wear every day expresses us perfectly, right? But it is also as a regulatory symbol and as a regulatory use, there is information on that label that is both mandatory, that is also helpful to you as a consumer to try and understand what might be in the bottle and make better decisions, which is really what we all talk about. Sue Green is having some Rio Madro Rioja. Excellent. Hi, Sue. So this is sort of the basic thing, is that a label is the means by which a producer is able to communicate important information about the wines to a consumer, a potential customer, i.e. you guys, which is very, very important. But I thought, as always, it would be really fun to add a little bit of history in there about wine labels. Which is, you know, like what kind of history is in a wine label, right? But it is true, they are a fairly recent development. So wine labels, I mean, it makes perfect sense when you think about it, but wine labels only started appearing around the late 1800s because glue didn't exist before then that was actually strong enough to hold the label, adhere it to the glass. So it's also important to think about in the grand scheme of wine history, right? The bottle is relatively recent in terms of a vessel for wine too. Long swaths of history went by where people were, you know, keeping wine in barrels, in amphora, in goat skins, things like that. These are all previously used vessels for containing wine. And up to the point even when glass became a viable option for both still, sparkling, and all wines, really, there weren't labels on it. They were basically sold unlabeled, if you will, and then held in bins. And so the bins were labeled, or the wine was put into a decanter. And so decanter labels were actually the predecessor to our wine bottle label, as it were. But as of now, of course, the label itself is pretty much, there are things that are mandatory, and a label, there's information that it does need to relay to the consumer in order to make that more fun. That being said, since it's its inception, the amount of information that is on a wine label is definitely increased, and every year there's more things that kind of show up that are required, you know, usage on your label. But at the same time, there's lots of stuff that isn't on the label. So what I want to do today is kind of talk through what is on the label, what isn't on the label, what some of those terms are that we might see and what they mean. And also, and hopefully open it up to any questions that you might have as well. Really quickly, I wanted to note that Therese has said she's drinking Louis Latour Grand Ardèche Chardonnay, but beautiful. Oh, thank you. That's a good, she's double fisting to kind of like drink and read. I think it's a nice option. You can kind of compare, contrast, right? It's great. But obviously international trade has made requirements for labeling more important because, you know, there does have to be regulations across countries. This wasn't always the necessity. Of course, some information is required, other information is purely optional, some information you will never even see on a label. And then, I mean, this is the idea, is that the better you are able to kind of understand what different parts of a label are, what they mean, the better you're possibly going to be able to know what to expect when you buy that bottle. You might not be able to know exactly what it tastes like, but you're going to be able to understand, hopefully, a little bit more to make a better informed decision, if you will. The main thing that I do want to point out on labeling and how bottles and wines are labeled in general, if you break it down to the barest minimum, what we're looking at is really two different kind of ways that a wine is going to be presented to a consumer. And one is going to be by defining the place of origin, essentially using the place as the calling card, or it's going to be using the varietal or the brand as the calling card. So this, if you're not familiar with it, can be very, very confusing. As Americans and as most of us may be or may not be, but as New World wine consumers, it's very typical to use varietal labeling. That means that you're using the grape. The grape will always appear on there. You know, you see Sauvignon Blanc, you see Chardonnay, you see these kind of grapes that you know, so that is how you identify the wine via the grape, and then you'll look at whatever the brand name is. Now, the old world wines, which is why I said getting a wine from Italy or from France, exactly like Therese Comte's Chateau Ferrier Margaux 2000, right? So that is, there's no grape name in that name. And that is because it is an old world wine that is defined by place. So these are the two main important things that we want to know, is that generally speaking, if it's an old world wine, you're not usually going to see a grape varietal on the label. Now, of course, I always have to have the caveat, times are a-changin', and you will, these days, it has become more commercially viable because more consumers are apt to buy wines when they know what it is. And a lot of New World wine consumers are used to seeing the varietal on the label. So I have started to see a lot of sort of some, I shouldn't say a lot, but some Burgundies, for example, putting Pinot Noir or Chardonnay on the label. Some Italian wines are already defined by the grape varietal as well. So, but as a generally speaking, when we're talking about old world is usually labeled by place, New World more so by the grape varietal specifically. So I'm starting off with required information, and this is just an example label that I'm using. The label itself is pretty helpful because it's actually, if you can imagine this, it's really long, right? And so this label is showing you the front and the back, because while the information is required, it doesn't necessarily have to be on the exact front of the label. It can be on the back of the label as well. So in this particular case, we're going to kind of look mostly at the back of the label there so that we can kind of see exactly what I'm talking about a little bit more close up. So some required information, for example, wine designation. Now this may seem really silly, but you'll notice on most bottles, it will say exactly this. It will say wine. It will say maybe table wine, red wine, white wine, sparkling wine. These kind of designating what the wine is required for the actual information on the label. Another thing that's required is the country of origin. So on every bottle, there should say somewhere on there what country it came from. As I was looking through labels and trying to pick stuff out for this, you know, I came across a label that said America, and I was like, wow. That is broad. I wouldn't have thought of that one. I hadn't seen that one a whole lot. But generally speaking, you're going to see the country that it comes from, or in most cases, especially in the EU or in old world countries, you're going to see something more akin to the appellation, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Another thing that's required on labels is, of course, the name and address of the importer, producer, or bottler. So this is where we're getting into required information for basically for accountability. Included in this is also things like the lot number, which you may notice to the sort of like on the right-hand side, you'll kind of see that there's an L12014 on there. This is also a way to sort of track we all are very aware of contact tracing now, right? So it's this idea of contact tracing your wine. Oh, Deborah has this wine. And yes, you did buy this from us because I know that we sold it. It was a very excellent wine, Rasteau. Rasteau, this is another thing, that's a place. So if you know Rasteau, that's how you're gonna know what is in the bottle, but we'll get to that too. Another thing that's required is always the volume, which is how, you know, the milliliters or, you know, liters. This is very helpful in case you are looking at something online. It looks like a full bottle. It might be 375 milliliters. That means half bottle. So don't be taken by surprise. And then also the alcohol is required. Now this is a tricky one. So that everyone is aware, when you're looking at the actual percentage, there is leeway in this, and it varies by country or by continent. So for example, in the European Union, there's about a 0.5% difference that you have leeway on that. So if it says 14%, it could be 14.5 or it could be 13.5. So you kind of have that 5% on either way leeway. In the United States, that is a 1.5% leeway. Much, much bigger in terms of what is that kind of like wiggle room for alcohol accountability, right? But it is very funny because sometimes you'll see, I'll see bottles of wine in particular from France or from, I have a bottle of wine actually from Bandol, the Tempier Rosé, and it says alcohol ABV 12 to 14%. So apparently it's okay to give a range too sometimes, which is kind of funny. And then finally, health-related info. So this is one that we see on almost everything, right? Everyone, and if we were here for a couple of times ago, we talked about sulfites. So it was regulation basically kind of globally that if there is 10 parts per million, or 10 milligrams per liter of sulfites in the wine, it must say contains sulfites on it. And if, for everyone who does remember, sulfites are organic compounds that occur naturally in wine, even during fermentation. So pretty much every single wine will contain at least 10 parts per million of sulfites in them. So pretty much every bottle of wine is going to say it contains sulfates after a certain date, of course. I don't have that exact date, but that's the general idea of what we're looking at for that, right? But other things you might see, a lot of times there'll be, you know, warnings for don't drink while pregnant. One of the fun ones, especially in Europe, they do it graphically. So you see a little pregnant woman drinking a glass of wine with a big X through it. You know, that's very, very, you know, straightforward. It just gets the point across. But the sort of health information that's on there that's required, for example, is that. So some other things that might be optional on there. Geographic reference. So this is where we're kind of getting, you do have to have the country of origin, but the geographic reference is where we start to get a little bit more specific, right? We're talking about Mendocino County here. And again, as I mentioned, remember, it can be on front and back labels. So this is just our front label right here. But technically, you don't have to put Mendocino County, you just have to put the country of origin. Most wines are going to include some sort of more specific area of delineation, which we're going to talk about, in order to help you understand what the wine is and imply a quality standard based on that location. Another really interesting thing, this is optional, vintage year. Why would it be optional? I will tell you why. Because for example, if you're drinking a non-vintage champagne, there will be no vintage on it. There are non-vintage still wines as well. So therefore, if there is multiple vintages that are blended together, you do not need to put the vintage on there, making it optional. Important to note both about the vintage year and then also our next one, which is the varietal information, very, very important. These do not necessarily mean it's 100%. So both in vintage and in varietal, based on country and place of origin, there is only a certain percentage required for it to be labeled varietally or of a vintage. And in some places it's 75%, some places it's 85%, some places it's 95%. Like in the EU, it's 95% for the vintage to be on there, but varietally it varies based on where you are. So just knowing that a lot of times in California, you may see it may say Cabernet Sauvignon on there, but there will be up to 25% of other varietals that are blended in there with it. So important to know, but also knowing that you have that kind of, there is a flexibility in there as well. And then there's also this, the environmental labeling. This is a really, really important one in terms of this is not required, obviously, but we see a lot more of it these days, right? You've got your organic biodynamic farming made with organic grapes. This is all usually, we have that little arrow there too, because it has a lot of times the California certified organic. This is one certification system that allows for organic grape growing identification, right? So you have, this is an option. You might see sustainable on there. You might see salmon safe. We've talked about this when we talked about or the organic and biodynamic farming a couple months ago. This is all part of what you can put on the label. And it's part of to represent how your wine is being made, but also to speak to a consumer who values that, right? That's also really important to know your customer. And that was all part of those things. Oh, the other one that was on there, sorry guys, before I go back. The other thing that I didn't have another slide for was just the idea of where the wine was bottled. And we'll kind of talk about this later. If it was bottled, you know, usually you might see it was bottled at a certain place or in a certain country or in a certain state or town. That just might be on the label as well. So the thing that we were talking about, place versus grape, right? So place is this idea of the appellation systems that exist globally. And an appellation system is really a naming system. It's a way for a country, usually they're defined by country individually. It's a way for a country to define a certain geographic area that may or may not have regulations associated with it, but that says this wine comes from this place. So it's a guarantee of provenance, right? And you can guarantee that this wine is from here and that you're going to get a certain expectation based on that location. This is kind of the old world is what is the appellation system is based on. Specifically, pretty much the AOC, Appellation d'origine contrôlée, which is the French appellation system. AOC system is kind of what a lot of the other countries have based their systems on. And like I said, it is based on very specific geographic locations. And these appellation systems, specifically the European ones and the French AOC systems, they have regulations that are tied to them. So if you're growing grapes and you want to put that place on your label, you have to follow their rules. Very, very important. Important to also note that geographical indication systems is kind of the same thing. So when we're talking about geographical indication, we're talking about a place of origin. However, there are also the idea of geographical delimitations, which is also defining a place of origin. And this is what we have in California, for example. The AVA system, the American Viticultural Area. This is defining a geographic boundary and naming it. So it's still an appellation system, it's a naming system. But in that geographical delimitation, there are no regulations that go with it. This is very true in a lot of New World wines. You have names of places that are geographically specified, but you can do whatever you want in there, as opposed to your AOC or your other designations that are Old World designations that you are required to follow all the rules, lots and lots of rules. So, but those rules are what help you as a consumer. If you know them, that's going to help you understand even better what's going to be in that bottle, because you'll know if you buy a Margaux, for example, like Therese has, you are going to know what to expect in terms of what those grapes are going to be, what to expect in terms of what the wine is going to taste like, whether it had oak on it or not, these kinds of things, because it's all part of the rules of the region. Whereas if you buy a wine of California, for example, or even a Santa Barbara, if it says Santa Barbara on it, you don't actually know if that's going to be Chardonnay or Pinot Noir or Sauvignon Blanc or Gewürztraminer. It could be. It could be any of those things. The name of the place doesn't define it. It's actually the producer itself that defines the rules. So one thing I want to mention is PDO and PGI. These are terms that come up. They were introduced these, I was mentioning the appellation systems are country oriented. The PDO and PGI is part of a system that the European Union put into place in 2008 to obviously sort of blanket over all of the countries that are part of the European Union. So PDO is protected designation of origin. Again, it's the same concept, but the PDO system is the EU's higher category. So all of those AOCs, all of the DOCs of Italy, DO of Spain, these are all part of the PDO system, whereas PGI, protected geographical indication, is sort of their lower category of more of the table wines, your Landweins of Germany, you know, your Vin de Table de France, you know, the same thing, your table wine of Italy. These are two different classifications that are specific to the EU. So that being said, there is definitely some other stuff that you're gonna see on the label. So these are kind of, those are main, just like what you normally see, but there's gonna be other stuff that is, people are gonna put on the label because they can, or because they want to. Sometimes it's going to be to help you as a consumer know what's gonna be in the bottle. Sometimes it's just gonna be to make their wine look better. You know, who knows? And then again, there's lots of things that will never ever go on a wine label, most specifically ingredient lists, unless you are a very, very dedicated producer who's dedicated to transparency, but there is no requirement to put what goes into your wine on the label itself, which is very, very interesting. So some things you might see on a label include words that deal with style and production. One that we see a lot, for example, unoaked Chardonnay, very, very popular, has become a very popular style. So therefore, unoaked Chardonnay is telling you that no oak was used during the process of making it. Yes, Nancy, exactly. Ridge actually puts the ingredients in there as well. Actually, also, I feel like the other producer is one of Brian's producers, the San Pietro, Tenuta San Pietro, the Gavis. They have, in Italian, of course, they basically put down like the bricks level, everything. So those are two fun producers to look at as well. So unoaked Chardonnay, it might also say oaked on there. You know, there might be something also in terms of barrel or barrique fermented or aged. These are just terms to let you know whether or not oak is on there, because some people like oak and some people don't. In different countries, you might see something else. Roble, R-O-B-L-E in Spanish means oak. So that will mean that there's been some sort of oak on there as well, without being part of the AOC. So none of these terms are regulated in any way. These are just sort of optional, if you will, right? Also unfined or unfiltered. This is referring to, of course, the process of winemaking, whether or not the fining or filtration was used in the process at all. And you as a consumer may prefer unfiltered wine because you feel like you get a more authentic flavor of the varietal itself, or of the terroir, or of the wine expression, right? Or unfined. You know, these are things that as a consumer you may be aware of, and if they put it on there, they think that you will like it better. Estate bottled. So this does have meaning. This does mean that it was made, that the bottle, everything was bottled at the estate of the winemaker. So that usually indicates not necessarily a smaller production, but it tends to be more prestigious in a way, and the idea that you're not sending your wine away to be bottled somewhere else, that you have the control, that there is control all the way into the bottle by the producer and by the winemaker, right? So I use this label in particular because it's French, and mise en bouteille à la propriété, right? That is basically just the French word for estate bottled. So you may see that sort of bouteille, these other kind of terms in different languages, simply meaning estate bottled. Now, cuvée is a term that simply means blend. And a blend, again, does not have to be a blend of different grape varietals. It can be a blend. You can put cuvée on pretty much any bottle of wine because almost all of them are a blend of different barrels or different lots, right? There's a variety of different ways that you can blend wines. So cuvée is a very, very broad term that is applicable to many, many wines. And some people just call it, this is our blend, this is our cuvée, indicating that. And then also there is the term, sometimes you might want to know if a wine is sweet or not. In particular, in German wines, in particular with Rieslings, we will note that there is oftentimes residual sugar in there. And you don't know, technically, if there is or not, a lot of times as a consumer. German wine labels deserve their own class. And in fact, next month they will be getting them because we will be doing a class on Germany and Austria. So, which I'm opening registration tomorrow. You'll get the email all tomorrow. But one thing you might see on, for example, Rieslings from Germany or even from Alsace, France, the word trocken, which means dry, or it might just say dry on there. What that means is that your wine is not sweet, that it does not have as much residual sugar in it. Sometimes even Alsatian wines will have sort of like a little scale in the back of like dry to sweet to help you know and anticipate how much residual sugar might be in the wine. So that's just kind of, it's not required again, but it is a way for producers to help you manage your expectations with what you're going to get once you open that bottle of wine, right? Now, there are some tricky terms that may appear on labels that can be confusing because sometimes they mean something and sometimes they don't. Reserve and reserva, this is a very, very challenging one and probably the most of all. But a lot of times you'll see, you know, California Reserve, and this one, for example, Falernia Reserva Carmenere. You know, these are wonderful wines, absolutely. The reserve doesn't mean anything in this particular case. And specifically in a lot of New World wines, reserve is simply their indication that they're saying this is a more prestigious wine, but it doesn't have any actual value or meaning in terms of what the wine production might actually be. Now, this is different, for example, in other countries. Reserva, for example, look at this Grand Reserva. This is indicating a particular aging requirement for Rioja. So that is where it can get a little tricky. There is also Rioja Reserva, which means it has very specific aging requirements in order to put that on the label. In Italy, Riserva also has another meaning as well, indicating that there was more aging or more oak use on there. Usually, if in Old World countries, you see that reserve, and this is the same also with Superior and Superiore in both France and Italy. This does indicate slightly higher alcohol requirements and usually slightly stricter aging requirements or production requirements. I know it's really funny for me to say this because when we talk about alcohol and higher alcohol requirements, I've probably mentioned this before, but I love it, so I'll mention it again. You know, back in the day in Europe, it was very, very, very cold. It's a much cooler climate than we have here in California, and it was more challenging to ripen your grapes. So people, because if you left your vines out long enough to ripen fully, you know, you might get frost during your harvest and then you'd lose everything. So to mitigate that, producers might choose to pick their grapes early. But if their grapes weren't ripe enough, then they don't have as much sugar in them, which means lower potential alcohol, which means lower alcohol in the wine. So a way to demand that people were sort of, the way to demand sort of ethics of production and quality was to demand a minimum alcohol level. And so with these Reserva or Superiore wines, they were saying you have to wait longer because your grape needs more sugar in it, which means it needs to ripen longer, which means that it will have a higher alcohol percentage in the finished product. So this is no longer an issue. Usually it's like between 11.5 and 12, or like 12 and 12.5% alcohol. These days we're lucky if we can see that anywhere and we're like, my gosh, it's like, how did they do that? How is it not 15% alcohol? Because it's really not a challenge to ripen grapes a lot of times as much as it used to be. So that kind of alcohol indication isn't quite as much. Grand Vin versus Grand Cru. Oh, here, exactly. So in Italy, Superiore, as part of the label, does have that indication of slightly higher alcohol levels. So in this particular case, we have, for example, this lovely little, you know, this says Grand Vin de France at the top. Very, very regal, very, very prestigious looking. Doesn't actually mean anything. It means great wine of France, but it doesn't have any indication in terms of the appellation, in terms of requirements or anything like that. You may see that too on other labels like Grand Vin de France or other, you know, sort of touting their excellence, but it's not necessarily part of the appellation. Now, in some cases, you know, when you see Grand Cru, usually that does indicate some sort of regulation within the individual appellation system. So in this particular case, we're looking at a Grand Cru Burgundy, and Grand Cru is its own AOC within Burgundy. So in order for it to say Grand Cru on there, it has some very, very, very strict regulations and very, very, very stringent requirements. So in this case, it would be very important for you to know that, because this bottle is going to be much, much more expensive, and you're going to say, whoa, how is that so expensive? It's because it's a Grand Cru. You may also see sometimes Bordeaux has Grand Cru Classé, which is part of their classification system as well. So Grand Vin usually doesn't have any kind of defined associations or regulations with it, whereas Grand Cru usually does. Old vines, vieux vin, which is the French term for that as well. Excuse me. This is a wonderful, wonderful term that usually indicates that the vines are older. Right? No brainer. That being said, there's no official designation of when a vine is officially old. So, you know, I mean, you could put, you know, old vine on there if your vines are, you know, 15 and you think that's old. Most of the time it's at least 20 years old or more, 30 plus really. But, you know, it can be, if the range can be anywhere from like 30 to 130, you know, that's a pretty big gap to know that old vine might mean, you know, gnarled, nasty, crazy, you know, producing one bunch every 3 years old, or it could just mean, you know, they're slowing down a little bit, but still working pretty hard. So that's kind of like the, you know, goes back and forth. So finally, I just want to show you guys, this is the label of what I am drinking tonight. So this is the Domaine Belleville, and I'm looking for some reason, I'm having, where are you? Usually I can do my little point to you guys. Oh, I found it. I was looking the whole time. Crazy. So here, my pointer, yay. So as we talked about, here's what I'm drinking tonight. Domaine Belleville is a producer name. We have the vintage here. Rouy is actually the appellation within Burgundy. So I know that this is a Blanc, and I know that that means it's Chardonnay, because Burgundy, white Burgundy is pretty much always Chardonnay. But Rouy is sort of the more specific designation, appellation, Rouy Contrôlé. So that's the AOC of France. This is basically the vineyard name. We didn't talk about that, but you can also, you'll see a lot of times just another name on there. It might be the proprietary name of the wine. For example, the Prisoner isn't anything other than just what they like to call their wine. But this one is actually referring to the vineyard itself. And then you have over here on the side, you can see it says Mise en bouteille au domaine. So that means it was domain bottled, so estate bottled, right? Over here, here's that little sign. I don't know if you guys can see that. It's the pregnant woman. Don't drink if you're pregnant. I know it's so hard to see. Sorry, guys. I feel like I'll add that in the thank you. I'll get a picture of it and send it to everyone so you can see it. We've got our alcohol level here, 13% alcohol. Vin de Bourgogne, it's just letting us know it's wine and it's from Burgundy. And over here, 750 milliliters, it's a full bottle. And right under here, you can see this is that lot number that I mentioned that does need to be on there for the purpose of being able to sort of trace this bottle of wine back to it in case something were bad with it, right? In case as a producer, you found out that, you know, this particular wine, you had a bunch of cork bottles from it, you might want to go ahead and reach out and know where that came from so you can try and adjust that issue, right? So that is that. So this is the wine that I'm drinking tonight. And with that, cheers to you all. And that is how to read a wine label. So much easier now, right? Gosh, thank goodness, all done. All right, well, thank you all very, very much. Have a wonderful evening. Goodbye, goodbye. Mwah, 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 mwah. Thank you all who joined me for the first time. I hope you enjoyed it. Please come back and I will see you all soon.
Thank you.
Take